Hello everyone, and welcome to the next section in this week's material. So what we're, again, just to recap, that we're looking at working with Google authentication and then being able to store an image to our Firebase console using that storage facility. Okay, so the way I've broken it down is I've tried to tie it in with the lab as best I can. So the main sections that we need to step through, and then I focus on kind of the main code snippets and kind of functionality that's going on, is these 5 steps here. So initially we're dealing with giving the user a Google sign-in option so that they can sign in with their Google credentials. Because of that, we can then display their profile image in the nav drawer. So we'll have to look at how we can grab the user's profile pic from Google and then display it within the at the moment the default kind of Homer image. We'll then look at storing a profile image in Firebase with those donations. So initially, when they log in, if it is their Google profile pic, what we will do is we will store that Google profile pic in storage in Firebase, as well as and associate that image with a particular donation. If they're not signed in with Google, if it's still a standard email password, we will store that basic kind of standard default picture image of Homer. Okay, the last two there then kind of ties back to maybe previous case studies you've seen, where we allow users to update their profile pic so that if they want to, they can click on that image and change whether it's the default Homer or whether it's their Google profile pic. We can change that. Now again, this is just within the system, so we're not actually changing the user's actual Google profile. That would take to be a lot more involved in that, but we are going to just obviously give them the user to the option to have a more personal experience within the app. So if they want to change their image, that they can. And then finally, because they've changed their images, the user would expect that any kind of existing donations that are there and that they've made already, tied to a previous profile pic, the user would expect those images to be updated. So that's what we need to do then as a kind of a final piece of the puzzle, and again we cover that in the lab. Okay, so we'll initially look at the Google sign-in option. So what we have here is we're bringing in a new class, Firebase Auth Manager, kind of so tying in with the kind of trying to stick with this MVVM approach again. So what we have within our Firebase Auth Manager, where we initially just were dealing with that standard kind of Firebase user and just dealing with the email password, we're now bringing in our Google sign-in client, okay, which will be specifically tied to their Google details, okay. And because of that, we introduce a couple of new functions. We have the one function there to just configure that Google sign-in, so to decide on the kind of, won't call them permissions, but what we're requesting. And again, we'll look at that in a minute. And also then a function, Firebase Auth with Google, that will take that Google sign-in account and kind of integrate it then into our own application. Okay, so there are the few functions we'll have a look at just tied to our Google sign-in. Okay, so looking at our configure Google sign, just kind of setting it all up. I suppose one point to note here is I've taken a lot of this from the official developer docs, and I have kind of the links and the references both I think in the lab, but at the end of this section as well. Excuse me. And then I've just tailored it to suit our own MVVM kind of implementation. Okay. So all this here I would have basically taken directly from the official Google Docs. Now, one point to note, and I kind of mentioned this in the elsewhere as well, because this default web_client ID is only generated after you build the project. You may get errors on this resource while you're in development and you're looking at kind of pre-build on your application, and that's fine. It will still actually build, it will run, and it will deploy and run correctly. Okay, so just kind of a little FYI on that one. Okay, so as I say, what we're doing here is we are requesting just a basic email, right? So if we wanted to leverage the our Firebase and our Google sign-in credentials, and we wanted to also maybe get access to their Google Drive, maybe with the Google Calendar, this is where you would do that. You would request these other kind of features that you want to bind to this to your Google sign-in options. Okay, and then what you do is you go off and using, again, this is all part of the library, so you need to make sure you have the correct libraries and dependencies as well as part of your project. We update. We have a Google sign-in client. So again, this is mutable data. This is within our Firebase auth manager. We pass in that GSO, as we call it there, GSO, right, into the Google sign-in get client call. So that will go and kind of coupled with your Google JSON or your JSON resources file that you pull down from your Firebase, confirm that you are who you say you are, and validate all those details behind the scenes. So this is all looked after for us within the library, so we don't have to write all this extra code ourselves. We essentially set up the Google sign-in options, what we want to request, and then we go and get it through that Google sign-in object there. Okay. So if we just continue to look at that, so that was our the configuring. Okay, so now the actual Firebase auth with Google. Okay, so this is kind of just making this is our callback, so to speak. So if you see here, we have an add on complete listener tied to an if else. Okay, and again, I've taken most of this from the developer docs again and tailored it to suit our MVVM implementation. So in here we have our Google sign-in account. Here we are getting the credentials based on that token from the Google, ECCT, the Google sign-in account, and using our Firebase auth.sign-in with credentials, passing in that credentials object. Okay, we have our .add-on complete listener. Now you could have a .on fail or on failure if you wanted to, but this is what they kind of supply in the docs, and it seems to work okay. So I'm happy enough to go with that. So what we do is, if that will return a task, this task instance. So if that task is successful, that means that the sign-in was successful, and we update with the users, with the signed-in users information. So all I'm doing here is just a kind of a little log to the console. Again, kind of in a release version, we probably wouldn't want to have these in there, but we update our live Firebase user with that now Firebase auth.current user. Okay, so that will now be, our live Firebase user will now be tied to a Google user as opposed to that kind of standard email password validation. And otherwise, if it's not successful, so if something happens along the way and we don't get to sign in correctly, we don't authenticate, what I do is I keep track of this error status as well, so that we can refer back to this. So if something goes wrong, or if the sign-in fails, right? Now I suppose we could display, and we do back in the UI, we will display a authentication fail to the user. But internally, we want to just keep track of that error status. So I set that to true. So that's just kind of another property that we add within the model that we're managing for our authentication. Okay, so where we actually then use that, so this is back in our dealing with the UI back inside that initial login activity. Okay, so what we want to happen is when the user would sign in with Google, so I would have given you the code there in the lab to add the button, kind of configure it to look like a Google sign in button. Okay, so this is what we're just binding to it here, using our view binding again, and then we have a simple click listener tied to it, which triggers that Google sign-in function. So inside our Google sign-in function there, which you can see it there, what we're doing is we are tying in with our login register view model. This is our MVVM, the .firebase auth manager, the .get client .value .sign intent. So we're creating a new intent. Okay, based on those that sign-in intent property that we've previously set up, and we start our own intent. Okay, now as I said in the lab, I'll take you through that kind of the complete code you need for all that. So instead of when we launch this intent, instead of jumping off to an activity within our fragment within an activity inside our own application, what we are tying into is the Google libraries and the Google sign-in process that kind of we're all familiar with. So what will happen is, if there is an account on the device, what will happen is a little dialog window will pop up. You'll be presented with that dialog window to choose a particular user, and then when you select that user, we will go through then the previously looked at authentication process, and then if it's okay, we will move on into the app itself, and if it's not okay, we just get that authentication failed. If there isn't a user on the device, again, all looked after first. We don't have to write this ourselves. You will be taken through adding a new account to the device. So as if this was a kind of a new phone you were setting up, there was no Google users, no kind of Gmail accounts on the device to begin with, and you'll be asked to log in to Google with your Gmail account, kind of accept some kind of permissions and what have you, and then you can choose that account, and then you can proceed again to authenticate or not against the application. Okay, so that's all tied to the Google sign-in. Okay, now what we do then is, once we have a authenticated correctly, what happens is we are taken then and launched into our kind of home activity. Okay, so one of the next steps that we're dealing with here is displaying that profile image in the nav drawer. So inside that on start, and where we're observing that logged in user, right? What I now add in is, once the user is not null, right, we call update, or have a function called update nav header, which passes in that Firebase user that we are kind of observing. So any changes, so if we were to sign out and sign back in again, new user, new Google credentials, new profile pic. Okay, so what I'm doing inside, we'll look at it again later on, but just to give you the kind of the quick code snippet now, inside that update nav header function, what I'm using is, I'm using Picasso to load up that image. So what we do is, and again, take it through the lab in this, whatever our current user happens to be, and I'm doing some checks here again. So if there is, we will, and I'll cover this now in the next few slides, but what we're doing is we're going to add a new field, new property to our model, where we introduce this photo URL so that we can keep track of a reference to that image, and that will tie to, if it's a Google user, will tie to the user's Google profile pic. Okay, so just doing a little check here, making sure that there is a URL and that there's not a display name. The reason I'm doing this check is that if you only sign in with your basic email and password, there is no photo and there is no display name, right? We're taking those from the Google credentials. Now, there's different approaches we could probably take with this. Maybe you could set a default display name, but this is just the approach I was taking. So what I'm doing here is, if this is technically a Google user, I set the display name, and then I use Picasso to load up that photo URL tied to the current user into the nav header image. Okay, and again, I will take you through this in the lab itself. We'll put this inside of a kind of a helper class as well. Okay, so what we get with that is something along these lines, is that these will be this Dave Tester's credentials. So here is his display name, here's his Gmail account, and for us, more importantly, this is the user's profile pic taken from the Google credentials that we have assigned within that photo URL. Okay, we'll see later on how we get to store that in our up on Firebase, and ultimately then how we could actually change that if we need to. Okay, so looking at the actual saving of that, what I do is I bring in a new separate class again, or in this case it's kind of an object, kind of a singleton, so we can just work with it directly. We have our properties there, so we bind to the storage, and I have an individual image URI that I'm going to keep track of. Again, mutable live data so that we can observe it, so when it changes we can reflect those changes immediately. And I introduce a couple of kind of helper functions. Okay, now I've kind of left in the comments that I kind of had for myself, just as a little kind of a to-do list, kind of a checklist, right? So there's quite a lot we need to do. First of all, we have to check the storage for an existing profile pic. So if this is a user coming back, okay, and has already signed in, we need to check to see, does that photo exist, and ultimately has that photo been changed? Because if they sign in with Google and they've changed the profile pic, it's the profile pic we need to get from Firebase. Okay, so what I'm saying is, if that is true, so this I will do some kind of basic checks in there. If that's true, we're going to update then the image URI, this here, with that current URI, so that going forward, any donations that the user makes, that's the URI, that's the image we want tied to those donations, right? If it's false, which means there is no existing profile pic, right, then we go add it to storage. And again, if it's a Google user that's signed in, we have to add their Google profile pic. If it's a default user, then we have to add the default image. Okay, and also tied to updating, we have to again call that check storage for updating a profile pic, and if one does exist, then we have to overwrite that existing photo, which has the knock-on effect of kind of requiring us to update any existing donations with the new profile pic. And again, I cover this in the demo, the last video of the app actually running, and I kind of have the console, for my Firebase console, open, so when I change the image, you can see the ripple effect through the collections on in our database of those changes being made. Okay, so we'll have a quick look at some of these functions. Okay, again, I'll give you these in the labs, but just to kind of talk a little bit about it here. So if we look at the first one there, are checking storage for an existing profile pic. Again, most of this I would have taken from the developer docs, okay, and just modified it to suit the needs of our particular application donation. Okay, so we're accessing our storage here, and again, we're like we saw with the database, we're getting in. I have a photos folder essentially up in my Firebase console within storage. And then I'm going to use, to uniquely identify, I'm going to use the user's ID to name the image so that it's easy then to associate the image with the user. Okay, if you wanted to just have one image across the board, you could actually use the file name itself, but because each user will have a different image, we obviously need to uniquely identify. So I'm using the user's ID that I'm passing in here to determine the name of the file. Okay, now the way this works is, even though I'm trying to reference an image, right, if that image isn't there, it'll fail, but it's not really an error as such. It just means that the image doesn't exist. So there's a subtle difference between something actually going wrong here and as in an error and a kind of possible potential crash in your application, or just an image not existing. So this will return or will be kind of successful in terms of that the image ref will have metadata, so excuse me, and information about the image itself. So if the image exists, we get the add-on success listener getting triggered, which in turn we actually download it. So we can get at that download URL, and once that completes, again, this is all taken directly from the developer docs, we update the image value URI with what was pulled down. So that's that will be the download link. So every time we load up our application, we can access that image and pull it down. So rather than having to download it every time we kind of refresh the page or whatever, I will update that image URI, and then because that's observable, if that changes, then changes are reflected across the overall application. And again, even though it's an on failure listener, all it means is that the file doesn't exist. So I set the image URI to an empty property. Okay, so that's just kind of one little point to note there. Okay, so that's just a code to check the storage. Now again, look, this is my particular approach to it. You could decide on a different approach, and that's fine. There's a lot of different ways to implement this. I just tried to factor it out as best I could and be able to reuse these then functions and these code snippets at different stages within the application. Okay, the upload image to Firebase, again, quite a lot going on there. So what we're passing in there is the user ID, a reference to the actual bitmap that we want to upload, and then a boolean to say whether we are updating or whether we're kind of adding, because they will be two separate things. Okay, and again, I've tried to comment it as best I can there. You can see we get the image view, so we get a reference. We have this we create a byte array output stream. We create this upload task. Okay, and then if we do a little bit of compression on it. So these are taken from the developer docs. Working with bitmaps, they're always compressed. Obviously, try and make the what we call it, the upload speeds as quick as possible. Okay, and then we convert that to a byte array. So we're working with bytes, and then working with our successful listener on the metadata again. So if the file does exist, right? So I do a check for are we updating an existing file, and we use our task to do that. Okay, so I'm within the upload task, get the new download URL, shall we say, right? Update our image URI, so we're getting a new image URI here. So we're looking at updating. So the user's gone off and chosen to change their image, and then we use our Firebase DB manager to update that image across the board. Okay, so we're passing in the user ID and the new image URI. So that's what causes that ripple effect that you will see in the demo as the last video. And again, final one there. If the file doesn't exist, we simply just update get the new image. So the image has been saved, and we update our image URI with that download link. So then it points to this is kind of like the first time that the file has been written and has been uploaded to our Firebase storage. Okay, let's look a little bit more on that. So what we kind of get within the storage is when the user signs in, we get in our, you can see there, this is in our photo. So look, there's a couple of photos going on there. So this is tied to that unique UID that Firebase has given the user. I just stick a .jpeg on the end of it, and again, just to show you, there's the image itself. So when we go back, or if we go back, and if the user goes back and wants to change this particular image, we have to go in and update this particular image. And the problem is, every time we update an image, the URI referencing that image will change, and that's why we need to have that kind of that update feature in there and have that ripple effect through the application. The ID obviously stays the same, but because the image has changed, the reference that Firebase keeps in storage to that image changes. So that's why we need to update it across all in our database and our donations as well. Okay. To look at the changes that we made inside our kind of our model, so to speak. So inside our donation model, here we are bringing in our profile pic. So just call it just of type string. So again, just be careful that we use it, keep it in the mappings as well. Okay. So this is how we can, even though we have kind of a separate links and a separate storage area for the photos, we still need to keep a reference to it inside our model itself. Okay, so that each donation will have a link, a reference to that profile pic. Okay, so this is to kind of just manage the changes. All right. So inside then our update nav header, these are the extra changes that we make. We are leveraging our Firebase image manager. So there we are inside that image URI. So we're observing this. So we're keeping track of that. So anytime that image URI changes, all this will get triggered. Okay. So what we're doing is again checking to see if the URI is empty, so there's nothing exists. checking to see if there's a photo URL. So is it a Google user? And if it is a Google user, update the image with that Google users, and then update the passing in a reference to the nav header image. Otherwise, we update with the default. So this is, we're choosing the user's Google photo. We're choosing the default launcher image if this is the first time that the user's kind of signing in and there's no images in storage already. Otherwise, there is an image, so we need to load that existing image from Firebase. So here we leverage the user update image, passing in the user's ID, again getting at the existing image URI, and then just identifying the nav header, the location, I suppose, the object that we want to update, which is that nav header image. So inside this, we'll see it now in a minute. That's where we were using Picasso. That was that code snippet that I showed you earlier. That's where we're using Picasso to update those details. Okay, and then finally we update the email with the user's email, and if the display name is not null, we update it with the user's display name. Okay, so again, different settings depending on whether you're a Google user or whether you're kind of a standard email password user. Okay, so in terms of managing those images again, and in terms of dealing with the kind of stuff that we would see inside the adapter, so to speak. Okay, so each time we load a row, what we're doing is inside our bind function, here we are, as well as assigning the donation using kind of our view binding. Here we are using Picasso, getting in at the donations profile pic, converting it to a URI and passing that into the .image icon. So this is the little code snippet that you will see in the changes that you will need to make inside your adapter to load up and assign an image to each donation that's added in your report. Okay, so this is what you get, something along these lines. So if you sign in with your Google user, this is what it'll look like. Again, Google user here again. This one is actually changed already. It's not the default one, but you can see here these are all images that would be now stored in Firebase in the storage bucket, I suppose, essentially, right? So the last kind of thing to do is allow the user to select and click on that Navdrawer image and update their image. Just to show you how to kind of tie back to, as I said, previous case studies. So again, a little bit going on here. So what we have is we would tie to that nav header image a little click listener, which will trigger one of those helper functions that show image picker, very similar to what we would have seen previously, passing in a previously built up intent launcher or a reference to an intent launcher. And here we are registering that image callback, so that this is what we want to happen when we return back from the picker, so that the user has chosen a particular image. And again, here we are using our Firebase image manager, our .update user image. So we're getting the particular logged in users UID that's taken from Firebase. Here we are calling read image URI, so that's getting a reference to the URI that we want to that we're pulling from the device itself, and then we're specifying the nav header image that we want to set. So it's inside here, you would have covered that before, the update user image. That's where we can upload it, and we check to see, is it the first time they've logged in? Do they already have an existing image up on Firebase within storage? And then going through all that process again, if it's there or if it's not. Okay. So what we get is inside our update user image, there's kind of a first full look at that. So essentially it's the using Picasso in different shapes and forms. Okay, so here we are passing in, and again working off that update, whether we're updating or not. So here we are where we implement a kind of a callback within Picasso itself. So this is a slightly more advanced usage than we would have seen in the adapter. Okay, so again, this all ties back to the fact that, does the image exist, does it not? So we are loading into, you can see it there, we have there's our image URI, which has been passed in. So that's the one we're getting from the whether it's a URI from the device or whether it's a URI tied back to an existing image that is one of those default images. And we're using our upload image again here to Firebase, passing in the user ID, passing in reference to the bitmap, and then a true or false as to whether we're updating or not. So hopefully that all works okay, and if it does, the image view, we set the image bitmap, so that will cause the user's image to update and cause the image to be uploaded to Firebase. Just for completeness on all the callbacks, we have to have our on bitmap fail. So at the moment, I just have my little Timber call in there, just saying that we couldn't process the bitmap. Something went wrong. Maybe there was something corrupt about the file that when it was opened up from the device and passed in here. We could, if you wanted it, maybe tie in some extra messages there, but from a kind of a release point of view, maybe we might just remove that, like I've done with this one here on prepare load, because there's nothing we're preparing prior to uploading this image, so we just leave it empty. Okay. So what you get with all that, something along these lines. So when the user signs in, this is taking us to our if a user does exist, we get to select a particular user. When they're signed in, there's their profile pic. If they choose to change the image, they get the picker, which is updated here, which is then also updated within the list as well. Okay, so how we go about updating those, and that's kind of like the final piece of the puzzle, okay, is running through the collections in our database and updating that profile pic field as necessary. Okay, so here we are binding to both the user's donations and the kind of the list of all donations. And what I do is I do most of my processing then on the user's donations here. So again, just because it's a child user ID, it's tied to the specific user ID. So in here, I'm adding an add listener for a single value event. Inside on our data changed, this is where we actually cause the updates to happen. So I run through, I basically pull down get the snapshot of all the donations tied to that individual user. Okay. I update and set that value to the new image URI, and there's the particular profile pic field, right? And then because we already have because we're going through each donation, I get the donations on all donations. I cause another update on each donation or each user's UID. Sorry, I take the UID from the donation that we're looking at. So that means as we're running through all donations, we're only going to set the value of the donation that matches the user's donation. So this is only going to update the relevant donations that are tied to the particular user. Okay, you could do it separately. You could actually do all this again and pull in a separate snapshot and run through the collection separately, but I just thought this was a little bit more efficient, because if we're inside and we know the user ID of that's tied to the donation anyway, we don't need to look at those donations or change those donations that don't match. Okay, but again, as I say, a lot of different ways that you could implement this particular feature. Okay, so what we get there then is this example here. If the user has changed their profile pic here, it gets changed, and within the list in our report, we get to see the new updated image, which in turn is updated in our storage. So again, you could keep an eye on that yourself. Just make sure that the image has been updated, but notice that the ID, I know I have it commented out here now, we're kind of blocked out, but the ID, the user ID and the name of the image will be the same. But I would encourage you to go in and have a look at the actual URI that gets generated by Firebase, because there's extra metadata tagged onto the end of it, and that changes every time you update that photo. So that's why we need to go back and update our database with that new URI. Okay. Other than that, I think that's about the lot. Yeah, those are references. Okay, so again, as I say, a lot of those code snippets I would have taken from those developer docs. Loads of examples up there. Great when they're that quick start Android within Firebase up on GitHub. Loads of examples, and then I would have just tailored it to suit the MVVM approach and tied it in with the live data with the particular view model. So we've introduced some new classes there specifically for managing a storage and working with those images. Okay. So look, other than that, thanks for listening, and any questions, again, as usual, you can find me on Slack. Okay, so thank you. Bye bye.